It's Thursday, September 17th, and welcome to the New York Amsterdam News Podcast. I'm Cyril Josh Barker. On this week's episode, my guest is Lurie Daniel Favors, Esquire, who is the Interim Director of the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar College. She's going to be speaking with me about the importance of the Black community's participation in the 2020 census as the September 30th deadline comes near. At the beginning of September, New York City's 2020 census response rate was 57.9%, several percentage points shy of the national average of 65%. Local leaders and elected officials are warning New Yorkers that it's their last chance to be counted for the next 10 years in the census, which has a September 30th deadline. Lurie Daniel Favors, Esquire, is on the team of community leaders getting the word out to Black New Yorkers about being counted. She was previously on the podcast in February when she was part of the NYC Complete Count campaign to ensure the city's full participation in the 2020 census, and she's on the phone with me right now to discuss what's going on during the final weeks of the U.S. Census. Welcome to the podcast, Lurie. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much. Well, listen, you and I actually spoke. We first spoke about the census back in February, and that was 8 months ago when things were very different. This was prior to COVID, and a lot has happened in those 8 months since we last spoke in February about the U.S. Census when we were at City Hall and we had that big meeting, to introduce the campaign to get people to fill out the census. Just to let you know and let all the listeners know that the census is our front page story this week in the Amsterdam News. It's also the lead story on our website at amsterdamnews.com. It's just such an important issue about the census, and now more than ever because of all the changes with COVID-19, the deadline changing, filling out the census now is more important than ever. Kind of give us some background on what's going on right now with the U.S. Census count.
So, Josh, when we spoke in February, the census was on track to continue as normal. And, in my mind, and I think in the mind of a lot of organizers who were doing community outreach and education campaigns around the census, and those of us who were also doing Get Out the Count campaigns, in our minds, we anticipated all of this being wrapped up, tied up in a neat little bow by the end of, say, June at the latest. Then came March, and then came COVID, and most of us had our offices shut down. We all ended up going remote, and we at the Center for Law and Social Justice had to do a complete pivot and shift from a very expensive on-the-ground campaign that we had lined up to one that was now completely virtual. So whereas in February we had plans, our CUNY census students had done a wonderful job of amassing a phenomenal database of every Black-owned hair salon, barbershop, daycare center, and faith-based institution that we could find in all of the 5 boroughs. We had teams of people lined up who were going to take everything from T-shirts, baseball caps, water bottles, every wonderful little piece of swag we could put together and deliver them to these institutions, talk with the clients there, because those were the spaces and the institutions in our community that at that time were the natural gathering spaces for our community. They were spaces where trusted voices could come together and have really in-depth conversation. You spend any Saturday afternoon in a Black-owned barbershop and you're going to cover everything from politics to psychology and everything in between. And then when COVID happened, none of those avenues were available to us at that time. And so we, at the Center for Law and Social Justice, we shifted to a completely virtual campaign. We zoomed out. We had Zooms going with every institution we could find. We were doing Facebook Live, Instagram Live. And now that the city has opened back up, we're in version of our campaign 3.0, where now our census team is hitting the streets at the places where we are now forced to gather. And unfortunately, for many in our community, that tends to be food distribution lines and sites where mutual aid support is given. So on any day of the week, 7 days a week, we have team members who are out in the streets connecting with food pantries, with faith-based institutions and organizations that are really distributing aid to our community members. And we are there with them, educating people about the census, getting them signed up on the spot, and happily giving away as much census swag as we can in the process. So, in our third version of this campaign, we are really now coming down to the wire and really just hitting an all-out effort to hit the streets. We're still in very close partnership with the city and many of the citywide census partners. And our effort right now is, assuming we only have 13 days left, and there's a little asterisk there because even that is an unknown right now. The census calendar has been cut The entire month of October was cut by this administration off the calendar arbitrarily towards the end of the summer. That's currently in litigation. So right now we have for sure up until September 30th, and many of our colleagues are in court fighting the good fight to see if we can get that month of October back. So right now it's all hands on deck, and we are in the streets every day trying to make sure that our communities are counted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want you to talk a little bit more about there might be a possible extension because of that litigation that's going on with that court case involving the National Urban League and the Department of Commerce to get the U.S. Census extended. I know that President Donald Trump had cut down the deadline to September 30th. It was supposed to end in October. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because even though there's a possibility, we kind of still need to act and be vigilant, in filling out the census and getting our neighbors and friends to fill it out as well. Will there be an extension? What do you think?
At this point, it's a hope and a prayer, right? We've gotten good information from the court, and thank God for organizations like the National Urban League that were able to take this all the way to the courthouse. There was a temporary restraining order issued against the Census Bureau, and that temporary restraining order said, "Listen, you have got to stop the winding down process." So, when the Trump administration cut the month of October, as you can imagine, there are tens of thousands of census workers out in the field, and you can't just stop an operation like that on a dime. And so the Census Bureau was really using the month of September to start winding down their outreach, to pull people out of the field and begin to wrap up their operation. Well, the judge in that case issued a temporary restraining order and said, wait a minute. We need to think about this for a minute. Right. Not only are you cutting the census calendar during the middle of a pandemic where people literally cannot be within a certain amount of feet of each other, you've got massive wildfires all up and down the West Coast. We're up to, I think, 9 states we're dealing with evacuation orders. You've got hurricanes in the southeast where entire populations are also under evacuation orders. And so the judge is still determining whether or not that temporary restraining order will be extended. Of course, that will likely be appealed. So we really don't know what's going to happen. But what we do know is we've got at least 13 days left as of today, Thursday.
Right.
And right now, within the city of New York, out of all of the boroughs, Brooklyn, unfortunately, is still in last place as we were in 2010.
Right.
The good news is we've at least hit, our 2010 numbers in most communities. The bad news is our 2010 numbers were horrifically undercounted. And for those of us who lived in communities that were ravaged by the coronavirus, for example, our hospitals, when Elmhurst Hospital was overrun, when Woodhull Hospital, when all of these hospitals were overrun and had to have those frozen ice trucks outside to hold the bodies of our loved ones, that was partially because our healthcare today in 2020 is being funded based on our census numbers from 2010. And if you live in a community that in 2010 had a 30, 40, 50% census response rate, as many of us do, then today our healthcare is being funded at 20, 30, 40, 50% of what it should be.
And I do want you to talk about Brooklyn a little more, because during this whole situation, this whole week when I was doing the story about the census, I spoke to many people, and the Brooklyn issue just seems, it's interesting that it's that borough. What are some reasons as to why Brooklyn is we're getting the turnout that we are from that borough?
Well, the reality is Brooklyn houses one of the largest gatherings of Pan-African people of anywhere in the country. So when you're thinking about who is a hard-to-count community, Brooklyn, there was a statistic that came out earlier that said 80% of the Brooklyn neighborhoods are considered what we call hard-to-count communities, which means up to 80% of the borough is literally comprised of neighborhoods that we could predictably say it's going to be extremely difficult to get a good count here. Why? A lot of people are transient and they move from one location to another. We have a huge number of renters. We have a huge number of immigrants. We have a huge number of people who are distrustful of government. All of these factors and many more really just sort of create the perfect storm in Brooklyn, such that we end up having a greater challenge there than we do in other places. That said, if anybody can come from behind, I know Brooklyn can come from behind. So if nothing else, Brooklyn, I just need us to show up and show out, because this pandemic recovery, this post-COVID era, not saying that we're in post-COVID right now, because frankly, we're still in that first wave. But whatever happens between now and the end of this pandemic is going to be funded based on our census dollars. So if in 2020 we don't have an accurate census count, our schools are going to be funded under what they should be. Let's say we only end up with a 50% response rate in Brooklyn. That means our schools are going to be funded at 50% for the next 10 years. Right. Our hospitals will be funded at 50% for the next 10 years. And our political representation will only be 50% of what it should be. So we won't even have the elected officials that we should have, who will be able to go into Albany and to City Hall to fight for us. Right. So it is imperative that we heed this call. And I know we are afraid of the census. A lot of us are like, listen, the census is the feds. Like, you literally have to get this information to the feds. And all I want to say is, listen, if you go on Facebook, if you use Google, if you buy something from Amazon, you are literally giving these private corporations more information about you than you would have to submit on the census form. And those corporations use that data about you to make their pockets fatter. Right. We need to fill out the census so that we can make our collective pockets fatter, and so we can ensure that we have the political power we need to ensure that we are never devastated by a pandemic like that again.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you about that, because a lot of people are skeptical of the census when it comes to the federal government coming in, finding out information. But I didn't realize that you do give a lot more information to Amazon and a lot of other websites before you do the U.S. government. But you're talking about political representation, which is something that we get into in the article. And I had a very interesting conversation with John Flateau, who's also at Medgar College, who gave me a little more detail and broke down about the representation of government that will disappear if there's an undercount in the census. Can you talk a little bit about the deadline was changed, and we all know that was a strategy by the Trump administration. Can you talk a little bit about what that strategy was? I think people need to know exactly why that was done, the deadline.
Well, far be it for me to try to determine what's happening in Donald Trump's mind or in the mind of any of these people who are in the administration. But what we can surmise is that, and this is information that really came out of a previous lawsuit, is that there are many people in this community, in this country, I should say, who do not want Black and brown communities filling out the census.
Right.
Why? Because the more of us fill out the census, the more resources we bring into our community, the more political representation we bring into our community. And if anyone has been paying attention right now, we are dealing with some folks who remind me of the people who were in power at the end of Reconstruction. That phenomenal period after slavery, where formerly enslaved African people were able to set up towns and communities and schools and become a part of government. We had more Black elected officials at that time than we've had ever since. And that period was violently suppressed and put down by white nationalist figures who determined they were not going to share resources and political power with their formerly enslaved property. And right now we are dealing with an energy in our community that is very reminiscent of that era. The more of us that fill out the census, the more money we get, the bigger slice of the pie we get. The more of us that fill out the census, the more we can send people to Congress who are going to fight for us unapologetically and explicitly. And so it is in the interest of those who are opposed to our community to prevent us from being able to do so. And while, I am a huge proponent of get out the vote, and we are actually pivoting to a Get Out the Vote campaign right after the census. The reality is the census is one of the things that, regardless of citizenship, regardless of nationality, it is one of the most fundamental, concrete ways we can pull money into our community. And people need to know your information on the census is protected by one of the strongest privacy protection laws that we have on the books anywhere in the country. Everyone who works for the Census Bureau takes a lifetime oath to protect the sanctity of your personal data. And if they were to ever share it with an agency, with anyone outside of the Census Bureau, they face a $250,000 fine and 5 years in a federal penitentiary. So we need people to know there are a lot of folks out there. Not everyone is down for we the people, right? Not everyone is looking out to ensure that all people are represented equitably, and we just have to be honest about that. And when we are filling out the census, And when states like New York are coming from behind, because there was a point where New York was way behind. And right now we have a fighting shot at being a leader of the pack. When people who are opposed to our communities having our equitable fair share see that, of course they are going to use their positions and their power and authority to do what they can to thwart that. So, whereas earlier this year, the Trump administration, recognizing the challenges of the COVID pandemic, had extended that calendar to October to ensure that we would get a full count. Randomly, arbitrarily, seemingly out of nowhere, during the summer, when people are often not paying attention, there was this shift in the calendar and a decision to cut off the entire month of October. So like I said, I'm not in their minds. I'm not in the habit of mind reading. But what I do know is that history, the principal Sankofa says we can look to the past to determine what's happening in the present and determine how we're going to build our future. Our past and our history in this country would suggest that there are people who are opposed to our communities being fully represented, which is why we must fill out the census.
Yeah. And I just want to point out that other than the financial impact, a census undercount could hurt the city and the state politically. I think it's important to note that. A lot of experts say that New York State could lose 1 or 2 seats in the House of Representatives. And so it's so important that we fill out the census and we get our neighbors. One of the things when I was talking to people this week about the census and filling it out, a lot of us have done the right thing. We've filled out the census. What should we be doing? Because we've already done our part. What are our marching orders? What should we be doing as people who've already done it?
Great question. I would say to everyone who's already filled out the census, thank you. We're halfway there because you are one half of that equation. But now I need everyone who filled out the census to pick up their phone, go to your contacts list, and individually text every single person in your phone to ask them if they filled out the census, and include a link to my2020census.gov or include the phone number 844-330-2020 and ask every single person in your contacts list if they filled out the census. And when they say yes, congratulate them and then tell them to do the same thing. And if they say no, say, hey, listen, my kid is 5 years old, for example. The next time we have an opportunity to bring money like this into our community, my kid will be 15 years old because we only do the census every 10 years. Even if you don't want to do the census for yourself, you know me, you know my kids, fill out the census for little Keisha, fill out the census for little Ray, right? Because this is about community dollars. I always give the example. Let's say we lived in a community of 100 families. Let's call that community Wakandaville. And in Wakandaville, there are 100 families. Rest in peace, Chadwick Boseman. In Wakandaville, there are 100 families. And according to the census formulas for that year, every family should get $1 in education services for every year for the next 10 years, which means every year the Wakandaville school should be able to count on getting $100 in education services so that they can meet the needs of their children. But if in Wakandaville only 40 of those families, or only 40% of the families fill out that census, instead of getting $100 every year for education services, we're only going to give $40 a year for education services. Why? Because when the 60 families who didn't fill out the census, it's as if they don't even appear, they don't even exist as it pertains to government funding, which would be fine if only the 40 families who filled out the census were going to send their kids to school in September. But that's not what happened. What happens is all 100 families send their children to school. And yes, those children are going to be educated, but instead of being educated on a budget that's appropriate for 100 of them, they're going to be educated on a budget for 40 of them. The same thing with political representation. Let's say, according to the census formulas, a community like Wakandaville should get 10 political representatives. And all 100 of us, our families fill out that census, we're going to have 10 votes in Congress. We're going to get 10 votes in Albany. We're going to get 10 votes in the city council. But unfortunately, in Wakandaville, only 40 families filled out the census, which means instead of having 10 votes to fight for things like affordable housing, instead of having 10 votes to fight for things like culturally responsive education or a proper education for children in a pandemic, instead of having 10 votes to fight for things like the end of stop and frisk and to reform policing and to defund policing and reinvest in our communities, we're only going to get 4 of those votes because we only had 40% of our families fill out the census. So when we're talking about dollars and cents, and we're out in these streets protesting, when people in our communities are protesting for education, protesting for investment in our communities, often what we're protesting for is a lack of financial resources and the lack of equitable resource distribution. Most of the decisions about who is getting access to what money is based on the census. So if we were more keyed into how these systems determine the distribution of resources and political power within our communities, we could protest about other things. And trust me, I'm not saying we shouldn't protest. I'm just saying a lot of what we protest about, we would not have to protest for if we had 100% participation in the census.
Right, and I think that's a really great analogy to use, Wakandaville, because we're very vocal about lack of things and lack of funding in our communities, but the census really does, filling it out, participating in the census really does allow us to it gives us a sense of control to be able to let people know who we are and that we exist. I just want to read some other statistics here. When it comes to self-response of the census, New York State actually ranks 33rd in the nation, and Nassau County in Long Island has the highest census response rate at 73%. And so obviously we know what goes on in Long Island. There's a lot of nice things out there. 73%, not all of it's nice, but a big majority of it is. And so we see that they're obviously getting taken care of because there's such an overwhelming number of people that are filling out that census. Well, listen, I do want you to give one last word to us about this push for the census and what it means. I think people just, it's more than just the 10 minutes. It's really creating 10 years, shaping the next 10 years of our future. What are your final words for everybody?
I would just say, it's not our fault that we don't know this information. I always tell people, if you know somebody who's 57 years or older, they're literally older than integration in this country, because 56 years ago, this country was passing laws like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, which are the three pieces of legislation that really indicate this country's pivot from a full embrace of segregation and Jim Crow laws to a policy that was going to embrace, at least in theory, the idea of integration. It's been 57 years since we've been able to register to vote without facing literacy tests, poll taxes, and lynch mobs. And I put an asterisk there, too, because if we see what's happening in states like Florida, where they're implementing poll taxes for formerly incarcerated persons to vote, we know that even that is very, very tenuous. So it's not our fault we don't know this information. However, if we are going to be a part of this society, we have got to become more sophisticated with how we engage with the systems that determine the distribution of resources and political power within our communities. And while we are, doing our best to beef up the education gap that exists about how these systems work, it is imperative that the little that we can do, we take the opportunity to do. And that right now, that census form and this election coming up, they are simple little things. These are not, I'm not asking you to build a building. I'm not asking you to cross a freeway during rush hour. These are simple little things that we can do that make a dynamic difference in the day-to-day application of our lives. Right now, in the city of New York, we just saw this morning, there was an announcement that DOE is scaling back or delaying the reopening of schools again. This is a resource issue. We've got parents who have contacted us who said, I got a keyboard for my child, but it's missing the letters E, R, and S. I don't know if you've ever tried to type a complete English sentence without certain keys on your keypad, but it's impossible to do so. Can't do it. These are resource issues. When we're talking about lack of food for our families, when we're talking about needing to cancel rent or wanting to ensure that people are not going to be thrust into one of the worst eviction and foreclosure crises that will make 2008 look like child's play. These are resource-heavy issues, and the fundamental key that determines the resource allocation more than anything else is going to be the census. Now, does this mean if we all fill out the census that white supremacy is not an issue? No.
No, let's be honest,
we live in the utopia? No. But it does mean we can make sure our basic needs are met so that when we do have to take it to the streets, it can be about something more than just our ability to breathe fresh air and eat fresh food.
All right. Well, listen, Lurie Daniel Favors, thank you so much. I think you've done a wonderful job with the census. Hopefully we get that extension. But again, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
That concludes this week's podcast. You can pick up the latest edition of the New York Amsterdam News on newsstands and get updates online at amsterdamnews.com. You can also keep up with us on Facebook at NY Amsterdam News and follow us on Twitter at NYAmNews. I'm Cyril Josh Barker. Thanks for listening.